Now let's think about um, the history of the United States from the time that Frederick Jackson Turner wrote until, say, today or the last part of the 20th century. And what we'll notice is that this sense of mission that drove the Americans really was with Americans all the way up until the time or during World War II, and World War II seemed to be the fulfillment of the American mission because the Americans came to the rescue of democracy and liberty throughout the world and emerged from World War II as the most powerful and most prosperous nation on earth. Um, and so it seemed there for a moment that the United States had really reached the pinnacle of what it of its sense of its own sense of mission. But World War II also opened up a lot of old wounds in American society that will challenge American society from then really for the rest of the century. And among those are going to be civil rights and gender rights and things like that that will come up. And also, the United States takes it abandons its since its policy of isolationism and takes on a leading role in the world as the world's really the first what we call superpower, um, and um, and will enter into a long conflict with the Soviet Union in what's called the Cold War. And then, as part of that Cold War, the United States, well, I should say it this way, the United States sees itself in the Cold War as the defender of liberty, as the defender of democracy, and that goes along with the American sense of mission. That the American sense of mission is not only to spread democracy, but to defend it. And communism, from the point of view of Americans, is not democratic. So it's actually antithetical, and it is actually theoretically as well as practically. All right. So then the United States then uh, engages in the world in different places. The United States engages in Korea, for example, because the Soviet-backed North Koreans invade South Korea, who was an ally of the United States, and that was kind of an extension of the Cold War. All right, or yeah, of the Cold War, and we see the same kind of thing happening in Southeast Asia with the French, except that the French were not really fighting against communism; they were fighting to maintain their empire in Southeast Asia. But and they were at war there for a long period of time, and it was devastating. It was very costly to the French, and but they were able to convince the Americans that it was also part of this Cold War, and so the Americans started to back the French. And then when the French were finally driven from Southeast Asia, the Americans stepped in their place. All right. So really what we saw happening was that the United States um, assumed responsibility for a war in theory in favor of defending democracy, but what was in fact a colonial war that was trying to perpetuate um, the French Empire, essentially, right? So from the point of view of the people of Vietnam, the American intervention wasn't an intervention that was going to save democracy. It was an intervention that was going to perpetuate colonialism, and so it was the Americans were unpopular, basically with almost everybody in Vietnam, and so when we look at, for example, the history of the United States, when the United States goes to Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was almost unanimously um, uh, adopted by the House and the Senate, right? but and so we can see then that when Americans went to Vietnam, they went there with this idea that this was a good thing, that this was what they were, it was their mission to defend and spread democracy. But as time goes by, and not that much time, we start to realize, Americans start to realize that what the United States says it's doing is not what it's actually doing. The United States isn't defending democracy. The United States is just basically propping up a regime that can't survive. Okay, and what makes this even worse is that the United States relies on a draft, meaning that everybody that's graduating from high school, basically the 18-year-olds and up, are subject to the draft, and it doesn't take long for them to realize that being drafted and being sent to Vietnam isn't patriotic, or at least it doesn't seem patriotic to them. And so there will be a mass anti-war movement that will eventually lead to the whole population eventually will become pretty much anti-war. Okay, so now what we really see then is that the turmoil of the 1960s will lead to the Carter calls it melees. It will lead to the melees of the 70s, meaning that, with the loss of the Vietnam War and with the Watergate and some of the cultural things that happened in the early part of the 70s, America will lose its sense of confidence in itself in many ways, right? So if we look back at the beginning of the 1960s, the Americans were convinced that they were at the forefront of history, and that they were the good guys, and what they were doing was right. But by the time we get to the middle of the 1970s, Americans are questioning their role in the world. A lot of other people are as well, right? And you can see that then in the national consciousness, that Americans start to question whether or not this idea of defending liberty, expanding liberty, is something that Americans should be doing. And so if you are a young scholar at this period of time, you go to college and you get your graduate degree and you start to study, but you're now studying from a different ontological outlook from the one that Frederick Jackson Turner had, because Frederick Jackson Turner lived with an ontology of the ever expanding progress of the United States. And now the scholars of the 1970s are going to be questioning that, and they'll have a more negative view of American expansion. And that becomes kind of manifest in a book that was written, it was published in, I think, 1983, and it's called The Legacy of Conquest by Patricia Limbrick. And what this book does is, as it says here on the screen, it rejects the Turner thesis, and instead it describes what happened in the West as a kind of a crime, that the Americans, driven by the profit motive, go into the West and they basically destroy things, ruin the environment, kill people, take over whatever they want, and it's all in the name of profit. Okay, so so this is a very different outlook, obviously, than what Frederick Jackson Turner had. This is a much more critical outlook, and when what we see happen, this is kind of the first of a series of different works that come from this period of time that will question or try to, I guess you could say, reinterpret our understanding of what happened in the West. And so this group of historians will be called the historians of the New West. The New West, okay? It's not that the West actually changed. All the things that happened in the West have already happened. They don't change. But the way that we tell the story of what happened has changed. And what caused that change in the way that we tell the story? It wasn't that the events themselves changed. It was that we changed. So what's ontological then is ontological on who we are, and then that uh, informs how we're going to look at events that happened in the past and in the present. Okay, well, why is this important? Well, the reason why it's important is that we look at Frederick Jackson Turner's writing and we conclude that is his ontological outlook is that of an expanding American progress. And then we look at Limerick's writing and we say that her writing is also a manifestation, but this is of a kind of an America in decline in a way, right? And what that means then is if we try to understand why Turner wrote what he wrote and why people in the 19th century did what they did, but we do it from an ontological outlook that's our own and not theirs, we can't understand it. We can't see it. We can only see our own judgment of it. Okay, so the challenge for historians is to essentially try to put ourselves in the shoes of the actors of the time. That doesn't excuse what they did. We can look at, for example, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington owning slaves. We can't condone them owning slaves, but we can understand why they thought it was okay to own slaves, not why we think it. We don't think it's that way. We're not going to change our mind about that, but we can understand why they thought it was okay. You follow? So that's the importance of what's ontological. We have to understand the point of view of where the author is coming from or where the actor is coming from. So now let's think about, okay, well, Frederick Jackson Turner paints this picture of this American progress expansion into the West, and Patricia Limerick paints this picture of American conquest, of American greed, and which one of these is true? And the answer is both of them are true to a certain extent, and both of them are false. But they're only true in their own ontological context, and they're false in a different ontological context.